Well, from a very young boy, age of 6 or 7, I was always interested in art, in drawing and painting. But my parents convinced me that there was no future in it. So when I grew up, I wouldn't make much money. But all the time, all the way through school, I was always interested in painting. Even when I went to university, I was studying science. I wanted to be an engineer because I was told that engineers made money. So my parents convinced me. I also wanted to be an Air Force pilot. That was a romantic dream. However, even in university, you know, I started the art club. I ran clubs for painting and so on. But it was always a little bit on the side, with my main intention to be a scientist. And so it went on. But I went to second university I went to was in the Midlands in England, and I met a sculptor there. And he was building wire sculptures and steel sculptures in the grounds of the university, and I was very impressed. So I started going to lessons to learn how to make molds, how to use clay, how to mix plaster and so on. And then I got a job in London. I was in the Midlands before, then I went down to London after getting my degrees to teach, because I didn't want really to be an engineer or a scientist in the active sense. I looked for a few jobs, but I was unimpressed. So I went to a teaching post in London. I chose a particular college which was an arts and science college. So in the daytime I was teaching science, in the evening I was being taught art. Every evening of the week I did printing, sculpture, painting, and this went on for a little time. Then I met my future wife, and I was still doing the same thing. I was teaching, she was a teacher, and then I was advised to go to a full-time arts course. So my wife said, all right, I'll earn the money, you go and become an artist. But I did teach a little. And this went on for 2 years. I went to an art college. It was a free situation. I could do what I wanted. But then inevitably, after a year and a half, my first son was going to be born, David Shishu, and my wife had to leave her job, and so I had to leave my art. Now I had to become the main income provider. So I packed up all my tools, my brushes, and said goodbye to art and settled down for 25 years of teaching. Then I became a student of Sri Chinmoy. And after a few years, quite a few, maybe 10 or so, I became really interested in sculpting him. And I remember saying to a friend, you know, I really would like to do a head of Sri Chinmoy. And he said to me, oh, do you think you have the capacity? And I thought, oh, maybe I haven't. Anyway, by 1989, I started my first clay head of Sri Chinmoy. And I was struggling a bit because I hadn't done it for many, many years. And then one evening, the head was there on the dining room table. All my family had gone to sleep. It was midnight. And I worked on the head. And miraculously, next morning, I worked all through the night for 6-7 hours. This beautiful head emerged. And I was astounded. I didn't know what happened. Anyway, that was my first head. And I brought it to New York, showed it to Sri Chinmoy. He said, make more. And from then on, Sri Chinmoy asked me to make many heads, not only of him, but of his friends, like President Mandela, President Gorbachev, his wife, Raisa Gorbachev. And so it proceeded. In 1996, Narada Michael Walden asked Sri Chinmoy for a statue of himself, of Sri Chinmoy. So Sri Chinmoy said, I will ask Kaivalya to make one. And in 1996, I made one, a full-size sculpture of Sri Chinmoy, and it went to San Francisco. That was my first attempt. After that, I was making heads of Sri Chinmoy's friends. And then Sri Chinmoy passed in 2007, and the boys in Oslo came to me and asked me to make a full-size statue of Sri Chinmoy to be placed in Oslo. And so I began in 2007, Christmas, and in 2008 I'd almost finished. I took the finished product to Prague to be cast in bronze. And there it was cast and it was placed in Oslo in October 2008. And that was the beginning of the series of full-size sculptures which I'm currently in the process of making. That statue we call the prayer statue, Sri Chinmoy with his hands folded in prayer. And since then, we've had one of these statues in Bali, in Prague, in Puerto Rico, now here in Nepal. The following year, I was asked to do a statue for Mexico, but they wanted a statue with Sri Chinmoy holding the torch. So I had to get to work very quickly because time was short. So I made a statue for Mazatlan, Mexico, of Sri Chinmoy holding the torch. Since then, we've had two more of those statues, one in Finland, in Vaasa, and just lately now in Seattle on the west coast of America. And these are proceeding now for the future. So the next statue for the torch will be in Rhode Island in April this year. And there will be more statues with the folded hand next in March in Perth, Australia, and then later on at some time, maybe in the summer, in Brazil, outside Rio, and then who knows after that. I think the Italians are very keen for Turin. My first statue of the folded hand, the very first one, I made in clay. I hired very cheaply. A friend of mine allowed me to use her studio in London in 2008, and I made the full-size statue in clay. You build a steel structure to support the weight of the clay, which is quite heavy. You put some polystyrene as foam around it to take up the bulk of the volume, and on top of that you put the clay. Now the clay cannot be moved very much, so you have to then make a mold from the clay. So I hired a friend, and he came and he covers the whole thing in silicon rubber to make the mold, in pieces, in sections, in about 7 sections. And that silicon rubber is supported by a polyester resin, which is a stiff substance which holds the rubber in place. Then you take that all off, you can then break up the clay and take away the frame, and now you have a negative of the original. That you can carry anywhere. And so my friend made a copy of that in resin for me, which I have now in my house. And also I took that mold to Prague for them to make bronze copies of that. So the first 4 or 5 copies of that statue were made in bronze. I have to say the best experience I had of all the statues was the very first one, which was most astounding because I was most insecure about how it would turn out, what it would be like. But I have to say Oslo still remains in my mind as the deepest experience of all the statues, even though this one here is in the most beautiful setting. When I was making the first statue for Narada way back in 1996, I had no facilities then because I'm not really a sculptor by profession. I'm just a school teacher, teaches science. And so I had no facilities, no studio, just the basic bare bones. And I was making the clay statue for Narada in my son's bedroom. So they were pushed to one side, and I used the middle of the room for the space. And I was working hard on it, and sometimes late into the night, early into the morning. And many, many times while I was working on the clay, I would get the strong vibration from the sculpture itself. And I even saw the eyes move and the head look down at me, when I was tired, like 3 o'clock in the morning after 8 hours working on it, thinking, oh, I'm working on the feet, on the bottom of the dhoti, thinking, I'm getting tired now. And I look up and I would see these eyes moving and looking at me. And it gave me such a thrill, such a source of energy. And I realized that I wasn't doing the sculpture, that Sri Chinmoy himself was doing the sculpture through me. And that happened many, many times. I had so much energy and so much power put through me to do the sculpture. And I feel that all based on my capacity and receptivity through meditation. Without meditation, I would not be receptive to this kind of influence. And so my meditation became fundamentally important. So I meditate normally as everybody else does, but I also meditate while I'm doing the sculpture. It becomes a meditation in itself. So the whole thing is a tremendous gift to me and I hope the sculptures to everybody else. Well, Sri Chinmoy's passing caused a great shock, but I feel a stronger person on the spiritual side of my life than before, even though I haven't got Sri Chinmoy's physical presence and his telephone calls encouraging me to do sculptures and either berating me or saying nice things about many of the works that I did. I still feel his presence so strongly because I spend a long time each week, maybe sometimes every day, working on the heads of Sri Chinmoy. I am doing them as a project of my own. Besides, I've finished now doing the full-size sculptures because they are now in the molds, and I just go and check out the molds. But I am working separately on heads. I want to do 27 heads of Sri Chinmoy for a future project, and I finished the first one, and I'm now working on the rest. And so I'm constantly looking at every photograph that I get of Sri Chinmoy, and it remains a constant inspiration. I have not been affected. I'm more inspired now than ever before. So each one's an inspiration and a meditation. There'll be different materials. Some will be bronze, some will be white polyester resin, some will be plaster, slightly off-white, and some I might try in clay fired in a kiln. That's going to be a new thing for me for the future. I haven't tried that yet. Well, my boon is that I complete these 27 heads and have still time for a new project, that Sri Chinmoy will keep me on this earth long enough with enough energy and capacity to finish the 27 heads and then go into maybe even more a bigger project. One possibility, which is way in my imagination, is to make a Kamakura-sized figure of Sri Chinmoy in stainless steel somewhere on the earth. That's my big hope for the future.